Sweet. Well, hey everyone. I'm glad to be here. Glad to have some stuff to share. Still love Ruby so much. I love getting to work in it. We're going to be talking about Docker. I've been thinking about this talk for a couple months now, and whenever I would type or tweet about my Docker talk, autocorrect would come up and suggest that I change talk to y'all, and it was really frustrating. So I'd cancel it out every time. But eventually, I just decided to go with it because this is the Atlanta Ruby user group. So we're going to talk about Docker, y'all. That's the focus for today. And really, the better name for the talk, though, is a minimum viable Docker server. I will explain that in a minute, but introduce myself. So I'm Josh. I'm coding it wrong on Twitter. And again, you can follow me there, or in response to the talk, find out if I'm actually coding it wrong or not. You can form your own opinion about that. I work at Big Nerd Ranch, and we're actually hiring right now as well for a senior web developer position. But our big focus now is just versatility. So if you're interested in multiple back-end languages, front-end languages, maybe dabbling in some iOS, some Android, we kind of do it all, and we'd love to talk to you. So for a senior developer role. When I talk about a minimum viable Docker server, this is a project that I've had for a couple months for my personal hobby apps. And so let me explain what's involved with that so you can get to see what I'm kind of focusing on. So my goal was to have lots of hobby apps in different technologies. And that related to what I just said about our focus on versatility. I've really gotten interested in cross-language stuff, and so keeping up with what's going on in PHP in the Elixir world, trying out Go and things like that. And so for my hobby work, I want the ability to start up apps, small ones, hobby apps, sandbox apps in different languages, different technologies. So for example, I have a couple of Rails apps that are personal use, just for tracking links. I made my own Pocket knockoff to store my own data for all my links for online that I read. A tiny little API that just kind of takes data from a few other APIs and sticks them together. So really, really small apps, just a few users. So I want to be able to run them. And so as I'm thinking about it, here's the criteria that I'm thinking about when I can run these apps. I want to minimize the cost, and I want to minimize the effort because I'm lazy. So minimize cost because none of these things are making me any money. I do have one hobby app that is charging people for stuff, I think $30 a year, doesn't cover the cost of my iOS developer's license, but it's nice to know that somebody likes my app a little bit. So, and all this other stuff is not going to make any money. That is not my interest because I'm not wired that way. So I need to minimize costs. I don't want to spend more and more for servers for all these tiny little apps I've got running. And I want it to be low effort as well. There's so much going on with experimentation, with these different languages. I want to make it easy to boot up a new hobby app. And so, the obvious answer is Heroku, certainly in our circles, now more and more in other language circles as well. It's an awesome platform as a service platform. I don't need to explain it to most of you. You've probably heard of it or used it. And especially the fact that there's a free tier for standalone apps. If it's an app that I'm just hitting once every couple weeks to play around with, it's free, and you have a certain number of hours a month to run it that they don't charge you anything for. So it's easy to have lots of apps up there that aren't running very often, and you can just forget about them. And then you could log in later, and you have 20 Heroku apps running, and you don't remember any of them because they have those very silly names that they auto-generate for you. But it's very useful, and if anyone here hasn't played with Heroku, I totally recommend it. So this is the worst Docker talk in the world where I'm telling you to use Heroku instead. I think you even use Docker with Heroku. I forget. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Nice. So yeah, for sandbox stuff, playing around, go with Heroku. It's amazing. It hides a lot of the complexity for you. But for some of my hobby apps, I have, again, despite the fact that I don't want to make any money with any of these, I have a little bit of a sense of I want these things to really work. When I was playing around with mine, I don't want the apps to sleep. And what this means is in Heroku, if I read the docs right, after about 30 minutes of inactivity, those free tier apps will go to sleep. And so they kind of put them out in storage, and it doesn't take a long time to spin back up. If you send it a request, it might take 5 seconds, 10 seconds to spin back up. But for apps that I was using throughout the day, that got kind of frustrating. And for apps that had a login that I wanted some of my friends to try out, it's hey, you might like this, you might find some use here. Giving them an app that might take 5 or 10 seconds to open is not really great. So I wanted to do better than that. So I'm definitely going to keep using Heroku for all my experimental stuff, but for my production hobby stuff, I want to find something else. And part of the reason why is that if you think about how Heroku's set up here, it kind of ends up being this pressure against small systems for your experimentation. If I think about, am I going to try Elixir? It's well, it's going to be another $5, $7 a month. how much do I really care about getting this Elixir app running? And so it's going to be a pressure to just not try it, like not bother. Or, use it in sandbox mode on Heroku, but not really spin it up for production use. Or I might even be tempted to say, well, I have my one Rails app. I'll just put a bunch of other functionality in it that's totally not related because I just need this one controller for this separate project use. And I do not want a mega Rails app. Like Rails apps are monolithic up enough as it is. I don't need it to be running 5 systems in one. So it kind of rubs my design sensibilities the wrong way. The next option you might reach for after Heroku, and many of you have probably done this before, is building out a custom server. So you got a cloud server. It's really easy to get those. They're pretty cheap. You can install a web server like Nginx on there. Passenger to run Rails. You can have several Rails apps running in there behind different domain names and things like that. They're all hitting a Postgres database. So you can get that installed and get that working, and it's great. So let's look at this custom server option in terms of those criteria I mentioned. Is it low cost? Well, yeah, definitely. Like it's probably one of the lowest costs out there you can do because you've got this cloud server. It's very cheap to get a nice small one. You're just installing stuff directly on there. That's as high performance as it can get. You can fit as much stuff on there as possible. Low cost. Is it low effort? Yeah, I wouldn't really say so. This is my previous couple of personal servers have been done this way. But the problem I run into is server cruft. And what server cruft means, in my context, is, so I'm setting up a new language. A little history on my career. I spent about 5 years in Java web development, and then about 5 years in PHP web development. And then I've been in Ruby Rails for 2 years, although, again, it's kind of going very diverse. I'm doing Java. The current client I'm at, got Java, got Ruby, got Elixir, got Go. So kind of like just check all the boxes. You got running all the languages. So, when I think about like having these hobby apps in different technologies, like I'm setting up all these languages on one box, have to install the operating system packages, maybe supplemental packages to get, database connectivity or like image processing working, to set up all the config files and find out where those are all placed, hook them all into the web server, and then, if I decide, okay, I'm done with this one language now, I don't need to mess with it, I'm not going to remember how to uninstall it all. I'm pretty sure I messed up a Unix box one time and tried to install one software package and like I uninstalled dir, like ls and cp and stuff like that. That doesn't even seem possible, but somehow I did that. So like I get very nervous uninstalling things from servers. The hard disk will fill up. So like this just the server just accrues more and more stuff on it, and that feels very dirty, especially when you're just going to be doing Rails development. It's like custom server, you're good to go. But I am finding that even in other contexts, people are diversifying more and more. We can use Rails for the 80% of things that it's really, really good at, and then you have a little Elixir microservice or a little Java microservice, having Go running in a background task. And so it's common in the Ruby world for folks to have, to be polyglot, to have other languages running. So I expect that's going to be common for me as well. So if you don't want to pay for Heroku for these hobby projects like this, and you don't want to have server cruft on a custom server, what can you do? Well, you can probably guess, because he already said the name of my talk. Docker is a great option for this. This talk isn't primarily an introduction to Docker per se. It's more about showing Docker in a real-world context of these kind of hobby apps that I'm working on. And so I'm going to be demonstrating a bit more about like how you can use it as opposed to all the details of making it work. But we're going to get into some of the details. So if you haven't run across Docker, it lets you run different applications in containers. And containers are a lot like virtual machines from my standpoint. You have one computer and you can run multiple things that are self-contained. The advantage of containers, again, if someone here knows a lot about containers, you can speak to it a lot more than me. From my standpoint, the big difference it makes is they're much lower overhead. And that means I can fit more things on my server and I can run it more cheaply. Again, low cost goal. So that's good. When the apps are running in these different containers, they can't affect one another. Unless you're Frank, you can hack into them. What's the name of the two vulnerabilities?
Spectre meltdown.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So I'm not talking about security. I don't know anything about security. This is hobby apps. But from a functionality standpoint, the apps can't affect one another, and so that lowers the effort. I can drop them in, and we'll show you just how that lowers the effort in a little bit. Also, you can get these Docker images. It's kind of these pre-set up container things with Elixir, Ruby, PHP, Java pre-installed. And so that lowers the effort again. Like just give me Ruby 2.5 and I've got it. And so you might think, as people in our industry tend to do, like Docker will solve all the problems forever, and we should just all use it, and everything is going to be easy. That is not generally the case for most solutions. I would say the sarcastic way I tweeted this recently was that Docker is not an abstraction. So let me actually explain what I mean by that. I think Docker trades one kind of complexity for another. And so I would not get into Docker, if you're thinking about learning Docker, I would not get into it as a way of getting out of server administration, because that has not been my experience. So like especially if you're running Docker on a server, like now running Docker on Heroku, maybe you get out of some of this, but if you're running Docker on your own server, like I'm going to be describing, you still have to get Docker running and installed. And you probably have to install stuff within the Docker images themselves as well to add like some extras. So you're still going to need to know some things about the command line, about tools and package management, and ports, and networking, and things like that. So it doesn't hide that. But instead, let me talk about the trade-off it does, because this is a very useful trade-off for me right now. The things that Docker does wrap up, it keeps you from needing to know the particulars of installing all these different languages on a server and hooking them into the web server. And instead, you end up learning kind of one common language, like the Docker language, not a programming language, but like one common setup. You learn how to set up a Docker image, how to get it running. And for me, working in consulting, that's a really good trade-off right now. Like if I can learn Docker and stay fresh on Docker, I'm using it on a project I'm on right now, and I've got that skill set. That's a very broadly useful. I mean, you hear talk about Docker everywhere. And that's more useful to me than knowing all these different languages, how to install them on a Linux server. So for me, this trade-off is good. It makes sense. As I'm talking about this, think about where you are, think about your experience level, what's interesting to you, what's useful to you for your career, and see if it makes sense to learn more about Docker right now. So I'm going to show a few different server architectures next, different ways you could use Docker on a server, and I'm going to show you the one that I landed on, and then we'll get into the details. So you could go all in on Docker. Like I said, you could say, this is going to solve all the problems. I'm sure everything will always be perfect, and so let's just do it all the Docker way. So there's a concept, it's a little small, but there's a concept called, or a tool called Docker Compose that's included with Docker. And this, like if you think about, like talk about these containers, this little self-contained thing that runs an app, mostly self-contained thing, right, that runs an app. Docker Compose lets you connect a few of them together. So you can get an Nginx container running your web server. You get your different Rails apps in different containers, and a Postgres database. And you can have one Docker Compose file that tells them how they all connect. And it gives them access to one another. So it's like kind of one file that just kind of shows your whole architecture for your whole system. And if you do this, it's really simple to get them to talk to one another. You just have a server, it's running Docker, on port 80, it all goes into here and everything talks to it. So that's really simple, but it does limit your flexibility a little bit. So it means they're all combined, like there's one file that knows about all these different pieces of the system. And at least, I'm sure there's a fancier way to do this, but in my setup, in like the simplest setup, when you're restarting one of these, you kind of end up restarting all of them. You bring down the whole Docker Compose set of services, and you bring them all back up. And so on my server, again, I'm talking about different independent web apps. Nobody's using the server, nobody's going to complain if it's down for a few seconds, but I'm like, it'd be nice if they were independent. It'd be nice if I could restart one without affecting the others. The other thing is, it's difficult in this setup to run any apps that aren't in Docker. So like, Docker is going to own port 80 or port 443 for secure here. It lives in that on your server. And so if I need to run something else that's not in Docker, I'm kind of limited. And things would get a little bit tricky. And again, I'm not ready to make that commitment because you're getting a sense of how, distractible I am when it comes to technologies. So instead, like, let's go to another extreme. Let's split things out. You could take kind of a Docker microservices approach. So in this setup, Nginx, your web server, is like directly installed on the server you're on. And then there's separate Docker Compose files, one per project. So each one specifies, hey, here's the Rails image and how it runs it. Here's the Postgres server or Redis or whatever that it needs. And so each file, like checked into each application's Git repository, would be its own Docker Compose file. And so this is pretty good. Like this is kind of a fairly typical way to think about Docker. It lets each app specify, here's everything I need to run. I need Postgres, well, I need MySQL, and I need a Redis as well. I don't need one. The Docker Compose file for each app will specify that. And you can run different domains on the same server. So that's really nice. And this is what I tried at first. And it worked really well for a little while. One thing I ran into, though, was the overhead of running separate Postgres images in memory. I haven't done, like a hobby project, I haven't done a ton of analysis to figure out the numbers and give you a nice graph. But it seemed like, my server ran out of memory. And then when I dropped this down, it didn't have Postgres running, it didn't have 3 different Postgres containers running. That was less memory because it was fewer things running. And so again, like this would be simpler than what I ended up with because it's easy to get the Rails apps and the Postgres apps talking to one another. But I wanted to flex a little bit back from this for the sake of cost. So here's what I ended up with. What I ended up with was just putting the apps themselves in Docker, but moving the Postgres database back out onto the server as well. So part of the reason why is it's really easy to install web server on just a basic server, and it's really easy to install Postgres and get it running. And as a good Rails person, Postgres is my database of choice. That's what I want to use. I'm sure I'll use some NoSQL in the future, but that Postgres is going to be my default. And so I knew that I would get a lot of use out of it. I've already got 3 Rails apps using it right now. And so this is a super simplified version of the diagram, so let me make it more confusing. Because it shows the versatility you get using Docker, but without some of the overhead of this multiple Postgres. So like in my case, I actually have a few different things going on. So I've got one, very basic apps. I've got one Rails app that's using Redis, but the others are not. The others are super simple. And so for that app, I put Redis into the Docker Compose file. I said, okay, for this application, boot up a Rails container, boot up a Redis container. But for the others, I'm not going to install that on the server yet. I'd expect after a couple months, a year or two, that maybe these other apps will need Redis as well. And at that point, it's like, okay, Redis, very typical to have cross application. Maybe I'd move it out to the host level at that point and move it out of Docker. But for now, it's easy to spin it up just in one container. I've also got this legacy Java app over here. It's actually, when I was coming out of the Java world, I was not yet comfortable with dynamic languages. There is a language called Groovy, which is a Java language just like Ruby. And there's a framework called Grails, so you could do Groovy on Grails if you wanted to. And that's what I was comfortable with at that point, so I did that. Wrote this app, and it's still around. I'm still using it. And so I wanted to move this over onto the server. So it's using MySQL. Didn't want to port it over yet, but I'm like, okay, you'll love MySQL probably. That's great. That's fine. I'm probably not going to be using MySQL for a whole lot of projects for now going forward. So I just left MySQL inside this container. And again, as soon as I actually working on re-implementing this in Rails, as soon as that happens, I can just drop this out. MySQL is gone. So again, just the things that, from a cost standpoint, the services that I know that I'm going to use on an ongoing basis, I stick those out directly installed on the server. And then anything that's app-specific and might go away, I keep it in Docker, and it's easy to add and remove it. So that's really the balance, the trade-off that I'm talking about to kind of try to minimize cost of the server and also minimize complexity of maintaining it. And so a lot of the rest of the talk is going to be diving into what it takes to make that happen. The one other thing, I mentioned Docker lock-in, Docker lock before. This also gives me the option if I have something that doesn't run very well in Docker, or I just find that I'm not loving Docker anymore, I kind of want to move away from it, I can run individual apps because it's just a plain Nginx installation connecting to whatever I want, connecting to a plain Postgres installation. I can choose system by system. And again, that gives me the most flexibility because I don't want to have to buy a new server and pay for another new server if I've got some things that don't run within Docker. I want that maximum attention deficit going on. So let's talk about that server architecture and what it takes practically to get Rails apps running in this kind of setup. And so there's going to be a lot of information. There's going to be a lot of config files. It's very exciting. I'm sorry I didn't warn you about that first so you could sneak out. But don't feel the need to write everything down because I've made a list of links that I'm going to share, the URL, and we'll post it in the comments of the meetup afterwards. The link in all the different services and more articles and stuff like that I use for learning this. So focus on the concepts, the big picture of ideas of how things fit together. Another note is you can run Docker locally if you want. For other languages, that can be really beneficial. But, Rails has been so fine-tuned to run really nicely locally, and certainly if you've been doing Rails for a couple of years, you've got a setup, you can get it installed and switch your Ruby versions and everything like that. So for local development, I still do it the normal way, just Rails and Postgres and Redis running directly on my machine. But for production, I use Docker. But you can test out the Docker setup locally. So like before I even started paying for a server, run Docker locally, make sure it all worked, and then I transfer it up. So I haven't even gotten into the meat of this talk, and that's already a lot of complexity. That's a lot of diagrams, charts. And so you might just say, Josh, shut up, and Heroku, take my money. This is exactly why I don't want to deal with this. And that's totally fine. Depending on where you're at with your career, depending on if you care about having those apps go to sleep or not, depending on if you want to move into server admin as one piece of your skill set, this may not be interesting at all. And so I'm sorry you came. I'm glad you're here, but I'm sorry for your sake. So maybe you could just be more and more convinced you're never to get into anything server side. But right now, this is working for me. The other caveat is that I'm not a server admin, and so I'm delving into waters here that I'm unfamiliar with. But I felt like I wanted to share it, and I wanted to take this chance to encourage all of you as well. Don't feel like you have to be an absolute expert in something before you can give a meetup talk. I'm sure Riaz would love suggestions and ideas like, hey, I would love to present on this topic in the next couple of months. I've heard several people really encourage me lately that, whenever if you know more than you knew a couple months ago, there's somebody else that doesn't know that yet that you can share that with. And so I would just encourage all of you, consider giving a meetup talk. Not everybody likes public speaking, that's fine. Like, consider writing a blog post, consider mentoring someone, or just hanging out at a hack night with somebody to share what you're learning. Because in the Ruby community in particular, like that kind of community focus, one of the gentlemen who was talking about a job search mentioned that he felt that this is a really supportive community. That's absolutely true. So whatever it looks like for you, help one another, like help others and share what you know. And this is a community especially that, like, if you share something that's not quite right, Frank may be over there and cough when you say something wrong, but he's very kind and will correct you gently, and others will as well. So I would just think, exactly, that too, yes. Good qualification. And specifically on this topic, getting back to what I'm going to be talking about, if you know Docker better than me, or server stuff, and you have suggestions, like, that would be great. Like, I would love to hear it. This is a great way for me to freely solicit advice. They say, don't ask a question on the internet, just like post your approach, and then like you're more likely to get corrected by somebody. But then you got your answer. So, if you want to get the answer, that's fine. But yeah, so it might be good to save, just because there is going to be a lot of info, it might be good to save those suggestions and corrections for the end. So think about that. So let's jump in. First, where to run it. I'm not going to get into servers too much, but for a number of years now, there's cloud server services. It's very easy to sign up. Choose a few options. You've got a server you can log into and install whatever software you want on it. The best value that I found seemed to be a DigitalOcean 3 gigabyte box for $15 a month. What I found is that my Rails apps, my small ones, are very RAM intensive, so I do not need a lot of storage space, but I need a lot of RAM, a lot of memory. And so this option was the best combination I found, but Amazon Web Services is good. Lineout, I've heard, if I'm pronouncing that right, is a good server option as well. So anything that gives you login and the ability to install software will work fine. But if you end up checking this out, this is a good option, a good value. So now let's talk about getting Rails apps running in Docker. Again, just a little bit of a high-level overview of the kind of things you might see to get the app running. There's something called a Docker file. So this is a file, kind of like your proc file or gem file, that would live in the root of your app, whether it's Rails or any other system. And it's the main file that specifies how to create your Docker image, do your setup. So I'll show you the file that I ended up with, following along with some online tutorials and tweaking them. The first line says the name of the image that you start from. So the idea in Docker is that you have these images which are kind of like saved disk states. And there's a bunch of them with different languages and tools and apps pre-installed. So this one has Ruby 2.5, which just came out, pre-installed. You just say, give me Ruby 2.5, and then you have it. Your wish is Docker's command. So you ask for the Ruby image, and then you run some commands. So this is an operating system specific command to install a package. I think it's Ubuntu or Debian or both. So this is what I was saying. You're not getting out of server admin by using Docker. You're just getting a package in a different way. So here, what we're doing, we're installing Node.js, and I'm a good Rails server-side developer, so that's only for compiling assets and having a Java runtime. Java. I just got myself in trouble. He's like, get out, get out. Yeah, have a JavaScript runtime too and compile those assets. But yeah, so you're diving down to the operating system level there. Then I went ahead and installed Foreman. Foreman for running multiple apps, multiple processes. It is very common, and probably more common in the Docker world, to have one Docker container per process. So if you've got Rails and you've got like Sidekick or Rescue or something, it's common to have several images. But again, I'm too cheap to do that. And so I'm just going to use Foreman like usual and run them all in one process. It works fine. And I found that installing Foreman globally here rather than from the gem file, I ran into a bug otherwise, and that's how I do it locally on my machine anyway, so that's how I did it here. So next, and again, I'm not getting into all the details of these Docker commands, like the run command and workdir and stuff like that, just kind of an overview of how these things come together. So we make a folder called My App, and we say this is the working directory. All future commands are going to be run in this folder. And then, so this part's kind of interesting. That's a little low. Can everybody see down there? Maybe not. Okay, we'll see. So, it'll scroll up later and you'll see. So we copy just the gem file and the gem file lock file into the Docker image, and then we run bundle install. And the reason I do that rather than copying the whole app has to do with how Docker does caching. So every time a command runs, Docker saves that copy of the disk image and caches it for later use. So then if something further down the line in your commands changes, it won't go all the way back to the Ruby image and start from scratch. It'll just start at the first thing that changed. So this lets you, if your gem file is changing less often than the rest of your code, unless you're really rubygems.org happy, then this is going to cache this, and the fairly long bundle install process, installing Nokogiri, native extensions, it caches all of that. So even if you make changes to your app or other things later, it doesn't need to rerun from scratch. That's the difference from virtual machines. So now, after the bundle is installed and it's saved, all those gems being installed, now we copy our app over. Copy dot being this whole directory, copy it into the image. And then we precompile the assets. And so this is something we could do. This is all at the build time. So it's building this once to get ready for running things. And so precompile all the assets so they're ready to go, all your JavaScript and images and CSS. And then we set some environment variables. So we can set these easily in our config file. It's kind of nice. All the things that float around in different places on a server all live in the Docker file. So we say Rails production to get some production-specific settings. We say log to standard out. If you've done some Heroku, this is familiar. Docker uses the same convention of just send the logs to standard out within this thing that's running, and I'll collect them and put them in a nice central place for you. And then we turn on serving static files so that those precompiled assets are served through here. In this setup, because it's running inside of a container, the web server doesn't really have access to those files to serve them directly. I'm sure there's a way you could set it up, but for my very simple, trivial setup, I haven't done that. So I just have Rails serve those static assets itself. Yeah, please.
Instead of a factor of not putting your environment, you have to find secrets in there that are pretty easy to do with Docker.
It is. I'm using not a Docker-related feature, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, that is a great distinction. This is just kind of structure setup stuff as opposed to secrets, because this would be committed into your repository and things like that. You tell Docker that what port is going to be available to the outside world. I'm just running typical Rails port 3000 here. We'll map that to other ports a little bit later. And now we start to run the commands. This has all been build time when you're building up the image. Now we're switching to the runtime command. What should the system do when you actually start up this Docker image running Rails? And so there's a few different things that I do. I run a db create and db migrate, and that way, the first time it's starting up, it'll just get the whole database set up. I think looking at it now, there's a more idiomatic, typical Rails way to do just db setup or something, maybe. So you could do that just as well. So we run that, and this way, maybe it was because of db migrate that I was thinking of that. Every time you restart the service, if you've had additional commits and stuff like that with migrations, this will at least rerun it. Maybe db setup will be as well. Yeah, not totally an expert. I'm just up here talking. Good times. So that's the first step. Whenever we run the app, let's do the migrations. Then we do this wait for it thing. And what this script does is this is a standalone script, and it says wait for Redis to be accessible on a host named Redis. We'll explain that in a minute. Or typical Redis port 6379. So again, this example I'm showing is the app that is actually using Redis as well as Postgres. So Docker was going to start up the way I set it up here. Postgres is already running. It's on my server. It's running all the time. But when Docker starts up, it's going to start Rails and Redis at the same time. And so you don't know which one's going to finish first. And so this is a common cross-platform script that will just wait for Redis to be available on that port. And then afterwards, you pass it the parameter. You say, okay, once that is ready, then start form. If you don't do that, then you might, depending on which gem you're using, if it's looking for Redis right away, it might just blow up and fail to start saying Redis is not ready yet. So that just enforces a sequence. Yes? That's a great question. That gets to the build time versus runtime distinction. So when it's, and this is getting a bit more into the Docker details, and so, but I want to give a little bit of explanation of that. So there's one command that says build the Docker image, and that doesn't actually start up any software. You actually can potentially do this just on your local computer, not even on the real server, but that's creating kind of like a saved disk image file that isn't running. So all those steps are just changing things in this virtual disk, but then, the naming of these steps is not great. In fact, run versus command, those are not very memorable names. What's the difference? But, that's a good point. Yeah, execute a command versus when you're actually running. That's a great insight, totally. Yeah, it is backwards, so we have to remember that it's backwards. I check the reference every time I'm in Docker. I don't remember any of this stuff. But yeah, the command is what happens every time you start it up, actually running on the server, and that's the command that it'll keep running there for you. Is that enough of an answer for the high level? Thanks for asking that. So that's what we need. We've got a bit of a complex command there to do a few different things, but this sets up our Docker file or image to be ready to run. The next slide is about those environment variables. So for anything that is secrets, I'm sure there's multiple ways to do it. I use the .env gem locally, and in my test environment often to have like the .env file where I put things like credentials for MailChimp and logins and things like that. And so you can actually just move this up out of your dev and test block into just with your basic gems, and then now .env Rails will be used in production as well. And then as a part of my separate build process that I'm not getting into here, you can just set up that .env file on the server with whatever of those secrets you need. And I'm trying to remember, when I go back, that copy step, it copies everything in the Maya folder in, it'll copy your .env file as well. So that's what I found for kind of keeping secrets for to make those available as environment variables. And again, it's I wanted to do things that were as similar to what I do in development as possible, so that I don't have to learn something new. Because I've got other things to learn new rather than infrastructure stuff. Okay, so that'll get Rails running within Docker. We haven't started it up yet, but I'll show that as a part of the next step. So that theoretically would run one Rails app, but how do we run multiple Docker web apps on one server? So conceptually, you can think about it like this, and if you've run multiple apps within with Passenger, like behind Apache or Nginx, this is pretty similar. Basically, you have a web server up here that runs. There's just one instance of it running, and it'll redirect to other different services depending on the domain name that comes in. So, like one of the domains is called mindset.com. Explain that later offline if you want. And so that corresponds to one of the Rails apps. And I might have that running on port 3001 locally. Then another domain, this one might be running on port 3002 locally. And so Nginx is set up that if I see this domain name, I redirect to this port locally. Same thing with the third one. So different requests are coming in for different domain names to this one server, and they go to different ports locally. So this web server is really just acting as a reverse proxy, I think is the term. Sorry? Gotcha. The docs that I read call it reverse proxy, but I do not understand enough to say it. Yeah. It's some kind of proxy that's doing that for you. So to get that running, this is maybe a bit out of order, but to show that how to do that, first I want to talk about this Docker Compose file. And like I described earlier, this is the file. If a Docker file creates one image for you to run one service, Docker Compose lets you stick several together. And so I'll show that. That's another file that can live. If you architect it the way we're talking about now, where each application runs individually. Okay. That's good. So if each of your apps has you can commit a separate Docker Compose file into the repository for it. And so let's walk through this file. There's a version thing at the top. It's not really matter. You're giving it a list of services, and you can call the first one web. This name is scoped based on the project, and so you can call it web for all of them if you want. You can call it Rails if you want to be very pro brand. And under there, so the first thing we say here is just say build dot, which basically says build an image based on the Docker file that's in the directory we're in right now. So that's nice and simple. We tell it what port outside the Docker image correspond to the port inside. So remember, the Docker image is like a virtual machine or like a standalone computer. It's going to run Rails on port 3000 inside of it, but that doesn't make it available outside on the host computer. This line is what makes it available. And the reason I'm changing the port number is as I showed before, I need each of my web apps running on a different port so that the web server can redirect to it. So here I say port 3000 inside the container corresponding to port 3003 outside the container. Again, this is very high level. You can tell me if you wish I hadn't gotten into the details of this config file. But if you look into Docker documentation, I've got some resources to recommend. If some of this is not clicking, you can kind of dig in there. Next, we set up links, which is like what other kind of Docker containers does this one need access to? Like I said, this is the app where the web app, the Rails app, needs access to Redis. So we just say link it to Redis. And then next we say, what's Redis? Well, Redis is the name of the service that I'm creating here. I built it from an image. And this image is just called Redis. Kind of like I had that Ruby 2.5 image before. In this case, I don't know anything about Redis versions, so just give me a Redis. Like just the latest one is fine. I don't care. And so that'll pull down that image and then create a container called Redis that I have access to here. So this says this web server can get access to it, and it's accessible under like the domain name or server name Redis. So that's why before we said Redis port 6379, you just call it Redis, and it's there. That's why I was saying earlier that things you can connect with Docker Compose, they connect very simply. It's really easy to get them to talk. It's going to be a bit complex in a few minutes when we try to get these containers to talk to the outside Postgres server. Go ahead. Yeah, the key here, the name of the service, that's the name that is available within the container. Yeah. So Docker Compose will get each of these individual pieces running. We've exposed them on these different port numbers. So now we need to set up Nginx to connect them. Nginx is a plain web server for reverse proxying, is one thing you can do with it. I've done Apache, is the other very commonly used web server. I've used that in the past. I hear good things about Nginx in the last 5 years, and I find the config to be less impenetrable. Apache is just very mind-blowing, and so Nginx makes a bit more sense, so I tried Nginx. It was fun to try. It worked pretty well. And so you have a config file for each of your servers in Nginx. So Nginx is on the host. It's not inside a Docker image. And you have one config file per server. So there's just a few things you have to do to get this set up. You say, listen on port 80, and then listen on, I think this means IPv6 port 80. I'm not 100% sure if my server needs IPv6. 5 years ago, I was told that all the IPv4 addresses were gone, but I keep getting them on my servers, so I don't know where they're coming from. I'm stealing them from all of you, maybe. I'm sorry. But I was like, well, might as well set it up to run on IPv6 because I don't want to have to think about it. But the tutorial said to do it, so I did it. It was fine. Next, you say what server name to listen to. So this is called links.codingitwrong.com. And so this says only use the config in this file when this is the incoming domain. That's how we have separate configs for the separate applications. And next, there's really just one more config to start out. We say location /, so like anything underneath this domain, you proxy pass, so pass the request somewhere else, and what it goes to is localhost 3003. So within this server, the Docker images are running on that server as well, and so from Nginx, you just go to localhost to get to the Docker image. This is the port we specified. So really, all this file is doing is saying this domain name maps to this port. Send the request onto there, and then once the response is received, take it back and forward it back out to the user who's making that request. We'll get to SSL in just a little bit. That'll be the last thing we get into. But this is enough to get your server started. And so with this, your Rails app will boot up. Requests will come in, and it'll be great. But then you try to submit a form, and you get problems. Errors like HTTP origin header didn't match request.base URL and valid authenticity token. And you might get sidetracked, like I possibly did, maybe, about why is the token not working? This always works for me in Rails. What's going on? But luckily, Stack Overflow exists, and there are answers to all your questions. So in this case, what was going on is, Rails CSRF tokens are still working. This little token that Rails puts in the request to make sure that some other third party isn't, faking requests and tricking you into click to something that's going to do something bad inside your app. Maybe someone's going to try to hack into my hobby app. I don't know, but Rails has got the security set up. And one of the things it does is it makes sure that the request comes from the domain name that you're supposed to be on. So if I'm on, hackersite.hackersite, and I click on a link that sends me over to links.codingitwrong.com, that's probably, like to post or to delete something, that's probably not intended. So Rails is going to kick it out. But we are on links.codingitwrong.com, so what's the deal? Well, we get the hint here, localhost 3003. Thinking about the files, we've seen that in Nginx config. What's happening is the user is sending the request, and they're on links.codingitwrong.com, but then Nginx, the web server, is not browsing that website, it's just making the request to localhost 3003. And so Rails sees that something weird's going on, things aren't matching it up, and it's going to play it safe. It's one of the great things about Rails is those secure defaults you get. And the weird thing about this, though, and this was not something I was able to figure out the answer for, was that it only happened in Safari. Now, I don't use Safari on my computer. I'm not crazy. You can use Safari if you want. But I got an iPhone. Some people have iPhones. Logging in Firefox is fine. Logging on my iPhone doesn't work. So I didn't look into why that's done. Clearly, Firefox and Chrome are using some other kind of headers or something. But when you look it up, you'll get an answer that makes some sense on Stack Overflow that says you got to set these other things as well. And these are all, you see these X things here. Oftentimes you'll run across these for proxies like this. And you can see like the word forward in there. So you can infer from that, oh yeah, this reverse proxy server is forwarding the request, and then it's coming back, and I'm sending along information. Like, what is this? What is the server the original request was on? What's the host and port the original request was on? And Rails knows to look for these headers. And so when it sees them, it says, oh, I get it. Like, you're forwarding it through a proxy, but the original request was from the right site. We're good to go. We're cool. So, again, this is some of what a server admin looks like if you're not, big into server admin. Is something goes weird, you Google it, you find an answer, you play around and get comfortable enough with it, and you're good to go. Certainly for hobby. So drop that in, and the database posts and forum submissions, stuff like that, are working just fine. But yeah, like, these complexities stack up. It's not quite the same as just installing it on Heroku. You got to know what's underneath the covers. All right, so now let's talk about getting Rails access to the database. Remember in the previous architecture, we had Postgres and Rails inside the Docker Compose file. That would be as easy as as that Redis thing was. You just say, hey, give me a DB, and the DB is from image Postgres, and then you just say connect to DB. You're good to go. So if you're willing to take the overhead of having multiple Postgres instances running in these different hobby apps, you're fine. But if not, if you want to kick it back out to the host, it's a little bit more trouble. It's not typical for a Docker image to go back and talk to a port on the host machine that's actually running Docker. When you're testing, so this is one of the things about testing things out locally. Docker runs on Mac, it runs great, and it's actually really easy there. You just say connect host Docker from Mac localhost, and that will kick you out of the Docker image back to the host you're running on. It'll see Postgres running on there, and everything will be fine. On Linux, there is no Docker for Linux localhost, unfortunately. So you gotta Google, and you gotta fiddle around a little bit. So what I found was, so there's a few commands you run in an order. This, again, Docker inside knowledge that you can learn about if you dive deeper. Docker exec means run a command inside a running Docker container. Yes, Philip in the back found that out. This is two different flags to get like it doesn't stand for interactive terminal, but you came up with that as well. These two together, I don't even know what each one does, but together they give you an interactive terminal into this service. Or you just think, Docker exec it. You can execute this, please. And again, we've got exec here in addition to run and command, so it's just very wonderful and very clear all the time. You type in the name of the image. That's incorrect. That's actually a container. I haven't gotten into images versus containers. I'm not going to get into it. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Container. It is container. Cool. I'll fix that for the next time. And so this, and then you can just say bin bash. This is how you get a command prompt inside of your Docker container. So I say, I get a command prompt, and then from there, I run IP root show, and then we get all the IP stuff that I don't know about. I told you I get IP4 addresses. Oh, these are internal ones, so that's fine. Of course I get those IP4 addresses. So I get a bunch of stuff spat out at me, but the important part, apparently, according to Stack Overflow, is that default via this number. In this context, apparently running within a Docker image, this is the IP address you can access that host on. And so you just take this number out from here, you drop it into your database YAML as the host for the database, or you supply it via an environment variable or something like that, different ways to do it. But one way or the other, you say, oh, we're no longer connecting to localhost for the database, because inside a Docker image, localhost is the Docker, inside a Docker container, localhost is the Docker container. It doesn't know about the outside server running. You have to use this IP address to get back out, to break out of Docker. There's a few more settings you need to add. Actually, so Postgres is pretty locked down and secure by default. This is one of the things I'm hoping for advice from Frank on, if there's a more secure way to do this. One of the things you need to do is, by default, Postgres, at least on this image I'm using, only is expecting connections from localhost. So you need to say, oh, no, I'll listen on different addresses to take requests in. And there's also another, that's in PostgreSQL.conf, and then also in pghba.conf, you add an entry that says, I don't know what each of these says, honestly. Figure these things out. But you basically say, okay, I can accept connections from
all databases, trust, subnetworks,
Did the /8 correct? Did I get that right-ish?
A little broad.
Okay. Cool. Maybe we can get a comment going on the meetup. Yeah. And honestly, I haven't even played around with this enough to see what range of IP addresses get assigned by Docker. But this was some way to kind of scope it down to say, okay, not just anybody can try to connect to my database. That would not be great. But something running on 172 dot whatever, that can get access to my database. That's okay. So you just open it up a little bit, just enough to make that database accessible on the host. Some hoops to jump through, but this has gotten us connecting to Postgres on the host, to save us some memory, to get us to fit a few more servers onto a few more web apps onto that server. One last thing is I wanted to make sure to get HTTPS. So there's a big push these days to get all websites secured. Even if it's just a content-only website, even if you're not taking logins, it protects your traffic, protects other third parties from seeing what you're doing, what you're interacting with. So much information being harvested these days that it's great to have all your requests secured. So I wanted to do that. Heroku has a very easy built-in way to get HTTPS now. It's really great. But there's these general tools. Like there's a service called Let's Encrypt that provides free SSL certificates. There's a tool called Certbot that works with it that you can run on the server to automatically verify and get a certificate and get it installed for you. And so it just takes a little bit of setup. So when you're running Certbot, there's a few different ways you can do it. But the way that seemed to work for me is Certbot wants to go in the public directory of your web app, and it's going to add a folder. The folder is called .wellknown. And it's going to drop a file or multiple files in there that has some kind of randomly generated string that says, hey, this is the string that this person requested on here when they said, I'm saying I own links.codingitwrong.com. Then their server is going to look at links.codingitwrong.com and see if that file shows up. And if it does, it's like, oh, yeah, that's the random string I generated. That's you. Like, you're verified. You're good to go. So we need that directory to be writable. If you're running the Rails app directly on the server, that's very easy. You know, that folder is there. I guess there's probably a Rails setting that would not make that available. You set it up so that that folder is available. But there's not this Certbot's running on the host machine, and our Rails app is inside a container. So we don't just have a folder we can drop it into. So Docker has this concept of volumes, which is basically like just a mounted folder so that a folder on your host is available inside the container. And so if you did something like that, like if you're using Docker locally for Rails development, or even for other development in other ecosystems, you do something like this. You say in your Docker file, hey, here's the volumes I want. Take dot, so the whole folder that I'm in on the server, on the development machine, make it available under my app. So this basically makes the whole application available inside of Docker and writable. So as you're changing any of your config files or classes or anything like that, or dropping in images, CSS files, it's all updated in real time inside of Docker. And so you could do that, but this is production. Like, we don't need access for all those files to run all the time. So you could lock it down a bit, and you could say, okay, well, just my public folder. Like, I really, I'm going to do a deployment if any of my classes are changing. I'm not crazy. Like, I'm a hobby, but, I'm not hacking things in real time on the server. I like Git. Git is great. I can push files up. And so you might say, okay, well, only my public directory I want to be mounted as a volume, right? So /public goes into my app. Even then, though, like, there's other files that live in public, and I didn't test it. Like, I can't tell if there's a performance issue, but I was like, well, it'd be nice to substitute it down. Frank's probably thinking of security things that have happened when, services hack in and can drop something in your public folder and then use your server for bad things. So, yeah. So let's not do that. We've been friends for a while. So let's not do it. Let's try to lock it down even further. So what I found is, really, we don't need all of the public folder writable. Really, we just need that .wellknown folder. And usually, Certbot will create that for you. But in our case, let's do it a bit ourselves. So we say, I want my app public well-known to be writable inside the Docker container. Outside of it, I'm not going to put it in the public folder because that make it confusing. I just make a Certbot folder. And in the Certbot folder, I just make a well-known. I think I probably committed that into version control. I don't think I scripted it anywhere to create that folder. I think maybe Docker Compose would actually make that folder for you. It doesn't need anything in it. It just needs to be empty and available for Certbot to write that file. So on your host, you have a Certbot folder with a well-known folder. And then you'll see in just a second how we'll use that and pass that to Certbot. So we have a writable folder now. And then we run the Certbot command. You do not need to know the details of this command. What you need to know is that you just run Certbot on your server. You tell it a bunch of stuff, like, here's me, and yes, I agree to everything. Yes, I have read all the terms of the agreement, even though I passed in this command line flag. Sure, you believe me. I say I'm using the web root method. I'm using the method where you drop a file in the web root. And then I say, go here. This is the folder to drop it into. Certbot, and then it says, okay, cool, I'm going to make that well-known folder. And it does its thing. So add a file in here, and then check this domain name. And then when that works, give me an HTTPS, a TLS certificate for this domain name so I can secure it. So Certbot will run. It puts the file in. You're good to go. It will error out because you haven't quite set up Docker Compose right, and so you try again once the timeout is done, if you're like me. So then we've got a certificate. Certbot will download it. That certificate file is somewhere on the disk. And so now you can go into Nginx and set your site to be secure. You can switch those port 80s, port 443, which is the standard HTTPS port. And then you put in a bunch of boilerplate. I don't understand. Frank does. A bunch of SSL config, maybe 5 or 6 lines. I forget if CertBot provided it or if I was just like reading instructions online, but I definitely don't know what it means. I just know I dropped it in. It's a hobby app. We're good. I have no idea. And with that, we're done looking at config files. Aren't you happy? So let's zoom back up at how this connects together. We've put together this custom server. Again, we did not get maximal simplicity, but we have managed to get Docker running to keep our app separate. We've got Nginx forwarding traffic, taking in those requests to different domain names. We've got CertBot to give us HTTPS, so even though this is a hobby app, we've got nice security. We've got our Docker images to run individual apps and all the services that are just unique to them that they need. And then you've got Postgres all configured to be able to access it out on the host. And then that way, you're not getting the overhead of running multiple versions of those. So, like I said, I do not expect all of you to be able to do that now. This is not a workshop where it's like, go and set up a server. This is great. But I do have resources to point you to where I learned this stuff and where you can learn it as well. So first one is a book and resource called Servers for Hackers. This guy, Chris Fidao, is in the PHP community. 99% of what he's showing is just general server setup. There's a website with a bunch of free articles and screencasts, and there's a book as well. $20 or something. Might have been $40, but it's great. Like, now that I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to do a little bit of server work. I'm not going to be able to get away from this in my career. Like, I want to know servers for hackers. Really, this is what it is it's server admin coming from a web developer perspective. So the things that you want to know, the way you think about code, it's going to explain servers to you and make it very useful. So that's really good. Drifting Ruby has my friend Dave is here, has an episode that was very helpful. So that was all not Rails specific. This episode here, production deployment in Ubuntu, walks through setting up an Ubuntu server. So Ubuntu is the Linux distribution that I hear most about in the last 5 years or so. Easy to set up, fairly up-to-date packages and things like that. And so the screencast is free, and I'll walk you through it, and then you can check out the paid screencast for even more Drifting Ruby goodness. It's great. For Docker, there's a few books I hear about. The Docker book is one that's explained to me and passed along to me. It's a great introduction to Docker concepts. It builds things up from the basics, from just like running Docker commands, exec it, to kind of creating images with a Docker file, Docker Compose, and even more advanced stuff that I don't want to learn because I want simplicity. But the Docker book is a great one to pick up as well. My next slide says questions. I imagine you probably have questions based on that. I don't know if you want to ask them or if you're ready to learn them. But that is my hobby server setup. If you're doing big production like enterprise Docker, you probably have something much more complex in place. Kubernetes, or Kubernetes, as I've heard it mispronounced, I think, is some kind of service. I kind of am taking pride in not knowing what it is at this point. It's like, I want a hobby server. So there's options. You've got your Heroku option, you've got the create your own custom server option, and I wanted to offer you a different one with Docker. When I hear about Docker, I hear, here's how to run it on your machine, and then here's these big complex enterprise systems. And but through playing around, I was able to get something kind of in between that is saving me a bit of money and get me a little bit of Docker experience, and it's a lot of fun. So, what questions do you have that you want to hear about in this context that your mind's not totally blown? I think you raise your hand first.
How do the different Rails services
Their own domain names?
Yeah.
If you're doing Rails to Rails, you could use the full domain name. Like if one of them was like an app, one of them was like a web service you were accessing. They could use the full domain name where they could go out and back in. I would think that you could, remember within a Docker container, you've got that IP address that is the host. And so like if this one's port 3001 and this one's port 3002, I would think the 172 address, port 3002 would get there. But if you have them all within one Docker Compose file, then you'd be able to use the name for the different service. But then the two, go ahead.
Okay. Correctly, if you have that, it actually goes to the actual container Compose file. Yeah. It actually adds in the name you put it in Docker Compose to that container name. So if one thing in there would treat that like container Compose.
I'm trying to get to that screen.
That's how it has to work.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a real application in Docker Compose. I was kind of wondering what the Docker Compose is only a single service, right? And essentially, we talk about scaling
Yeah, that's a great point. I forgot to mention scaling. So that's another thing I'm not doing here, which so that does not the reason that the Docker Compose is there. So Docker provides facilities for that to say, hey, I've got this web container and I want 10 of them running within here, or like these other fancy services probably let you do that across multiple servers and stuff like that. So that might, oh, we run the battery all the way down? Oh, there we go. We just made it. Yeah, so in this case, I'm not doing any of that kind of scaling. So I set up Docker Compose. Actually, it relates to the sequence I went through, where at first each of them did have its own database. And so I did need the Docker Compose. But then when I dropped it out, A, I was lazy, so I didn't move back away from that. But B, I had some of them, that service that needed Redis and the Java one that needed MySQL, and those had a Docker Compose. And so I was erring, for simplicity, I was erring a bit more on the side of, let's use Docker Compose for all of them, and that way it's less for me to change. I think you can just run the basic Docker command if you just have that one image and nothing connected to it. And so that'll be a way to do it a bit simpler. Maybe there's some overhead that you save, but the complexity of their different services now run different.
Yeah, I'll say the main thing is I think you can configure Docker Compose to have an n number of processes.
You can also, if you're using something like last install, you can deploy your Docker Compose files directly to the install, which is sweet that you choose to do. And then with the architecture, obviously, as it needs.
Yeah, good way to do it.
There's a great point. I'll say something real quick in response to that. Like, as you think about, like, I'm not intending to set up these hobby Docker servers for clients, but we've had several projects that use a Docker-based infrastructure, and even Roku CI platforms will be Docker-based now. Circle CI 2.0 is, and so the knowledge transfers over. Like, what I've learned about Docker plugs into these other environments as well, so that's very helpful. So even though I'm not using scaling or anything like that. Other questions?
I wanted to add the thing how I got my hands on Docker is to use it locally for development. It's a really good thing. You can just start a project. You just put everything in there, like virtual machine, and if you mess up, you can roll back, and it doesn't affect your environment because if you do anything on your actual computer, then you mess up, you have to reinstall everything, especially if it's serious or something. Maybe you have different databases, different languages, it's all eventually become a mess. You create Docker for every simple project you have. It's very handy, and you get a little bit of feel of what it's like, and it kind of gets you. Because Docker Compose, like I do have a lot of Linux admin background, and it's still even quite complicated for me. So it's kind of a little bit advanced than I usually see when people who do like big scale projects. So it's kind of messy. But if you just want to use Docker, kind of better virtual machine and get a little bit of experience of system administration, it's really start just use like Docker command.
Yeah, and that's absolutely how I started with Docker as well. So read a tutorial, check out that Docker book. It's going to walk you through running it locally on your computer. And Docker has been, for Mac, has been native running there for a couple years now. Definitely.
The only caveat, it's really hard to pass files around. So if you don't want to keep code inside Docker, you want to keep code maybe locally, and then you want Docker to use regular code, you have to do it through NFS or rsync, because native synchronization of folders is extremely slow, just painfully slow. So you have to find different workarounds. If you can do it, set them up, which was a big problem. Then after this, it's super easy. This is how you can find. If you have a lot of code, then Rails will run for a very long time if you just use native functionality.
Yeah, I think I've heard about that. I think it relates to the volumes feature. So like volumes is available, supposed to be able to do it, but I've heard that there's performance problems on the Mac.
Very slow.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Super serial question. Back in your Docker file where you reference from Ruby 2.5.0 and then you did a bundle install, does the Docker image come with a bundle already installed, or do they make the bundle into the Ruby 2.5 release?
They did not. I actually just read about the release notes and how bundle was supposed to be included with Ruby 2.5, and if I read it correctly from Ruby Together, it did not make it in. But this is something to see what features are available there. You can actually look on Docker Hub, I think is the name of the site, and it'll tell you all the images, like for Ruby or for Postgres or for Redis. It'll tell you pretty easily in there how to use them, what's installed, what's included, and things like that. So like here's the Docker Hub page for Ruby. Here's all the different versions of it. So there's like numbered versions of Ruby, and there's different versions of the image. Like Alpine is a kind of Linux that is super stripped down. So like that would allow me to fit more stuff on my server. The Alpine actually doesn't have like that package manager built in, or like even some there was like some dependencies that were not available to build Ruby gems. And again, I'm going for simplicity. I'm like, I will try to go down to the smaller Ruby Alpine when I need it, but for now I'm just going to use the basic Ruby image. But down here, there's some quick reference. What is Ruby? That's good. Let's see if it mentions bundle on here. Yes, it's mentioning bundle on the way. So like they're pre-installing bundle because if you're using Ruby, you're using bundle, and so that's why it's included in there. Right.
Sorry, I didn't want to do too big of a plug because it's a slightly different technology. If you have an old computer lying around, or you want to build a NAS, maybe not so old. FreeNAS is a FreeBSD based NAS, but it also has built-in spinning up FreeBSD jails and also Docker. So you can actually run this in your own house, and you can either do a cheap build or you can put down some money on a NAS. But that's one way to host it literally in your house if you want.
And again, in that case, because you're using Docker there, you're not going to install those things all custom. You can, the idea of like dev production parity, like you could run that Docker image locally, and then the same thing can run publicly, as opposed to having to figure out how do I install it on Mac OS, if you're using Mac OS, or Windows, whatever, how do I install it on Ubuntu or FreeBSD. Docker gives you like this common deployment target to code for.
And I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess this could be for either of y'all, but if you were just more interested in like setting up a server at home and not necessarily hosting an application for a bunch of people, so you could just set up
FreeNAS,
a server.
literally, yeah. Just get some drives.
I got
and
spoiled that liner out.
there's some other ones too. FreeNAS works better if you use ZFS, which works better if you have actual separate drives. But we can talk about that later if you want to. Rockspot? That's Rockspot? Okay. So that's another good recommendation.
Ponce is a bare metal hypervisor, which uses now they use LXC, which is what Docker was originally, its foundation and framework was built on. So you can run it on the home machine as a hypervisor. You can install images like a Ruby image or a Ubuntu image, then launch an entire computer, a virtual machine with, just like you would a normal computer.
Typically, you would set up a virtual, so you have your machine, right, your physical machine, and it has RAM, like maybe you put 16 gigs of RAM in it. So you would divide that into virtual machines, and then in a virtual machine, you would run all the Docker you want, and as long as you're not doing too much other stuff, your Docker can use up to the whole resources of the system, or however you want to partition it.
It has the same overhead and stuff.
Right.
Are you going to put this in a Docker container?
Proxmox or any kind of LXC hypervisor, it's bare metal. So you install a OS on the computer, and from within there, you can run virtual machines.
Didn't need to draw that out
Yeah.
further.
Yeah.
I'll pop my URL up there so you can read. If you go to this link, I don't mean to cut off the questions. I'm not cutting off the questions, but I just wanted to get this on the screen. If you go to bit.ly Docker y'all, you'll get all the links for the things I mentioned and some others as well. Basically, the key articles that I found help me put this together. But so I'm not trying to stop things unless we need to. Other questions that anyone has?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of, I worry about sometimes about, I'm not saying constantly into this, but I worry about the vulnerabilities and things like the image taking a Docker Hub, right? So like Ruby seems like it would be good, right? But like last year's had one. It's very easy to go like, oh, here's somebody's computer. I'll just use that computer disk on my, big production system. It seems like it's kind of inviting a lot of potential people that have some disk that have a lot of
Docker Hub, you can see other clouds, so you can see instructions. So you know exactly what's there.
Let's see. Yeah, so from, I see what you're saying. Like the Docker.
Yeah, maybe probably
will still changes with the.
Yeah, I think you download some random Docker Hub. Yeah.
Also, that you can have your own private Docker repository. So, you can specifically verify that all the code in the Docker file is good and everything. stabilizes user changes that repository.
Part of the answer to your question is Docker does that on purpose. There's a proprietary premium you can pay
Right.
and use.
And that's what
Not a repo of images or containers. That's partly that Docker was born in Red Hat, and that's just the way the DNA of Red Hat. It's all proprietary lock-in, pay a premium to do anything, so people control the world. So if you don't like it, that's Docker. There's one called Docker that's really pipeline. I'm joking, but it actually is a Docker. That's if you want to deal with Docker, you're gonna have to play in the world that's created by Red Hat.
Well, you can always go to your own Docker platform.
But Patrick's problem is not distinct to Docker. We had the same problem with Ruby gems and then the JavaScript cesspool.
It should be more worried about that. Right. That's how it should be more worried about that than it should be with you're gonna get off the PM, right? Not
The PM is just petrifying.
It's like private listening, trying to jam, different bots for Ruby or that kind of thing. And then Node is slow space. Even every Node project, you're going to have hundreds of independents.
Yeah, you kind of like maybe get that what he's talking about too, or you kind of chain that through to, this one's got, the previous one, you gotta have understand 10 Docker files.
But generally speaking, from my experience, Docker files are generally a lot simpler. They're a lot easier to read the exact commands. Compared to, thousands, tens of 100,000 lines of code that, might actually inject more your standard funnel install or Node.js yarn install.
Yeah, I agree. Or even I've used Vagrant for virtual machines in the past. You download Vagrant images, but there's not really a way to review what's in it other than just looking through the whole file system. Whereas with Docker, you start with, I was just referencing, you may have seen, base images are the starting points, which are generally, I guess you can make your own, but generally you start from fresh Ubuntu or fresh FreeBSD or fresh whatever. And then from that point, if you trust those, and if you believe that Docker has sufficiently got those locked down, you can browse all the commands that are applied after that, or apply your own commands to build up a Ruby box from scratch or whatever. If you need something, again, you want to make it as efficient as possible. You want to eke out every last bit of performance, or your fork of Ruby with your own features or whatever.
Because the other thing is building from scratch, right?
You have Gen 2 now.
Remember, that was one of all the things that Docker does not abstract away. That's one of the things it does. I would like Ruby 2.5, please. I would like Elixir 1.6 or whatever, please. And so removing that piece for me to make it easy to spin up locally or on a server is nice for hobby work when I don't need to dig into that level of security. I think it'd be good to call it at this point. I'm going to be around for more questions. What were you going to say?
Oh, nothing. Great talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.